It looks like we just opened. Shoot, I had this in my head. I was gonna like pull out my vape pen and do like a, oh hello, I didn't see you walk in to the audience. But then I realized that like my CBD pen is not in my pocket for some reason.
It's too much CBD, man. You got to cut down.
It's ruining it for me. So we are here. This is welcome to Insurrection with Brenton Lengel, formerly carried on the Starcom radio network, now carried on the internet because schedules are hard. I'm your host, Brenton Lengel. I am a writer, activist, journalist, and I am joined by Bobby of the 5x5 podcast, or formerly 5x5. Now it's the Moustache Mafia podcast. Bobby, you want to introduce yourself to these folks?
Hi, fine people. I'm Bobby of the Moustache Mafia podcast. I examine a lot of cultural, political, and newsworthy items. I try to do it every week, but these last couple weeks have been a little rough, guys. So check out my content if you enjoy this. Brenton's content is also great if you're listening to this on my channel.
Absolutely. By the way, for those of you who are following me for my creative work, Snow White Zombie 2 is out. The early copies have been shipped. I am signing them and sending them out over the next week. You will have them before Halloween, which is really exciting. We also have the Reign of the Blood-Covered King mini comic. This is being included with anybody who gave $30 or more. And I'm really excited to get this shipped out to you guys because it's a comic about the origins of a zombie plague in a kingdom run by an insane ruler who ruins everything. And it's escapist fantasy.
Nothing like what's going on right now. Nothing
at all. Also, you guys, this is a really cool postcard that I'm sending out. And,
that's neat.
This is done by Brian Silverbacks. It's an alternate coloration of his cover, and as you can see, we have Grandma popping out of the big bad Granny Wolf from the first issue. All right, so beyond my wonderful literary contribution, we've got George Orwell, one of the greatest writers of all time.
He's kind of OP because he lived in that time when like you could just write the next great novel, and we're still living in like the shadow of all of those guys.
Yeah,
so he had it, and he didn't have YouTube and freaking PlayStation 4 to distract him from writing the next great English novel.
He didn't have
OnlyFans. He didn't have OnlyFans. He had to go to like some weird seedy pub.
Yeah, it's funny, by the way, also like with all this, like with regard to Kickstarter, I'm so annoyed because I would send out these surveys for everybody to get their benefits for the Kickstarter, and like everyone would respond, but my jackass friends, they never responded. And then I'm like, okay, do you want this? Do you not want this? What's going on? And now I'm going through and like my wife printed out a list for me. And there is stuff on here, but my wife she put out a list for me of all of the people who did not provide a mailing address, and it's all my friends
because they don't want to like cost you money or whatever.
Yeah. Well, then they can tell me that rather than not having this. But yeah, so basically, I've got to track down all of my jerk friends and get them. And Orwell didn't have this problem. Is how I tied that back in.
No, not at all. All his jerk friends probably made fun of his books to his face.
Yeah. So, absolutely.
Yeah, God, yeah, they're English.
So, all right. So we are now on to chapter 5 of Homage to Catalonia. If you are just joining us and you haven't seen this before, there are 4 other chapters before this. This is the nonfiction. It was odd is because Orwell is primarily known as a fiction author. Oftentimes this gets shelved and sold in fiction. But this is the nonfiction account of George Orwell fighting with the left Marx. BZ Douglas, am I one of the jerk friends? I don't recall getting an email. You may very well be. I haven't gone down the entire list, but I did send out the email. So if you didn't get one, yeah, it's probably you. So
Don't be that guy, man.
Don't be that guy. So George Orwell fighting with a left Marxist unit, the POUM, during the Spanish Civil War. And Bobby is a U.S. combat veteran and also an all-around very well-read guy. He's read all of the scary books that Jordan Peterson assures us that none of us should read because it will infect us like a mind virus.
It did, and I turned into a were postmodernist and steal people's toothbrushes every full moon.
Exactly. So, all right. Why don't you start us off? So, where did we leave off at the end of chapter 4?
We left off with him going to the siege of a city called Huesca, where he was going to be besieging a Francoist unit in a city. And in this chapter, it comes grinding to a halt because this is the chapter where he decides to give all the political background of the conflict that we're in.
Yeah, so Orwell's just like, hey, all this exciting stuff that's happening with me sneaking up and taking pot shots at fascists. And,
screeching halt.
If I remember that, greatest writer of all time, George Orwell. Screeching halt.
Screeching halt. I mean, it happens in every book. I just reread Dune, and that happens like around like 150 pages in. It comes to like a screeching halt.
Well, it's a thing, particularly of authors in that day and age where they didn't have quite so much to compete with people for their attention. So let's hear about the complicated politics of the Spanish Civil War.
So first off, in this chapter, Orwell realizes something that I keep harping on in every chapter that we talk about in this book is that warfare is politics. It's caused by politics, and it's the continuation of politics through violence. He mentions that he was completely uninterested in the actual nitty-gritty politics of the war before he came over, and even as a journalist, he was only reporting on it superficially. He had the idea that he was fighting fascism for decency and humanity, without kind of realizing that those themselves are political goals that he's using violence to enforce. And
because liberalism likes to cloak itself and be like, we're not an ideology, we're not politics.
Right, but it is. It absolutely
is politics.
Yeah, everything is politics, and it's interesting to me that he didn't realize that.
You'd think Orwell of all people would have figured that out,
but he was young and dumb and going to war, so it's not something that even now. We've been at war for 20 years, so the inevitable concept of why are we over in these wars will come up on a deployment, but like we don't have serious dialectical conversations about it now, and your average guy who's enlisting to go to war now isn't really having that conversation before they go over there thinking America good, terrorism bad. I go to war. I mean, I did it, so I'm not dumping on anybody that did. So
but then you read, depressing French authors and realized the error of your ways.
I really did. It's ironic too that he's talking that he was very surprised that there's units of anarchists who are to the left of the actual mainline socialists. And it is something that's really weird when you read this chapter, when he starts talking about the Stalinists and the Comintern people being like on the right wing of the revolution, because you don't think of a socialist revolution as having a right wing. But there is still internal politics in it, and it is really interesting when he gets into it. Of course, I might be like one of the only people that finds this chapter interesting, but that's one. You got one.
You're selling it to the audience. We already lost somebody.
Oh, did we? Oh, God, I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. Keep going. What do we got?
So if you don't understand the politics that lead to the war, you're not going to understand the war itself, which is something that it comes up a lot in this chapter, that people overseas don't understand the politics that led to this conflict, and they don't really understand what the war is about, because Franco really is actually trying to establish like a neo-feudalist regime in fascist Spain with the assistance of international capital and with the assistance explicitly of Italy and Nazi Germany. But people are framing it in terms of specifically a fight against Hitler's fascism and for liberal democracy, which definitely isn't the whole picture of it. It's ignoring the 100-year cause of this war. Something interesting, that the city that he's in, or outside of trying to get into in this chapter, 100 years, like almost evenly to when he's doing this siege, was a key battle in the First Carlist War, which was the first Republican insurrection against the restored monarchy of Spain.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. If you're interested in Spanish history specifically, you should look at the Carlist Wars. They started in the 1830s, and then on and off, they went up to about like 1873, which was basically liberal monarchists versus more conservative monarchists. And that city was one of the same places that that war was decided in. But he gets stuck with a bunch of British expats who are also in the international brigade with him, and he actually gets educated about the politics here in a dusty, dirty farmhouse, and he gets a better political education about the ideologies that are going on right now here in a dirty, dank farmhouse with a bunch of dirty British people than he did before as a journalist, as somebody who's a very educated person. And I made a special little note there because that is kind of a failing that we have today. Especially on the left, I think, is that our ideology and our messaging, it's kind of intimidating to people. Like you referenced that I've read a lot of really scary theory books.
Yeah.
And it is a really big impediment to advancing an ideology when you can't actually boil it down to somebody in a dirty, dank farmhouse without a bunch of visual aids and a PowerPoint.
It's a very good point.
Yeah, it's something. It's not only in politics, philosophy too. The philosophy that like he would have been familiar with and that was going around his time were like best-selling books. Now, contemporary philosophy, it's in the journals, and you have to read like 2 dictionaries to understand what's going on. So I was actually really pleased to see that he was learning about political ideology in a dank, dark farmhouse, even though I doubt he would have been happy about it.
Well, I remember I was watching one of these other left tubers, Plastic Pills, and he was doing like a couple videos on like the concept of like the concept of the real and stuff. And I remember like watching this and being like, I have very little idea what he's talking about.
Yeah, it's super intimidating, and that puts a lot of people off. And
you normally figure this stuff out based on context clues and stuff. So
yeah, and Orwell talks about that here too. Is one of the big failures of the revolution in this chapter that he talks about is that there was never an attempt at a rising in Morocco, and there was never an attempt at propagandizing the people behind the lines in Franco's territory. And we'll get into maybe more realpolitik reasons for that, but another reason for that might be that the propaganda was ineffective and it wasn't able to be disseminated as easily to the guy living comfortably in a town, or it wasn't seen as a revolution of the people in colonial Morocco. It was seen as a revolution of the people in Spain, when in fact it was a broad workers' movement.
Yeah.
So that shows you kind of the importance of effective messaging and propaganda.
Well, not just that, but also, you know, I think there was one of the reasons they didn't push for a revolution in Morocco, because you would think the Moroccans would very much be on their side or be natural allies in this, but a lot of them wound up fighting with Franco. And it was, I think in a lot of ways, the Republic was unwilling to kind of let go of that part of its empire, you know?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, like, it'd be like if there was a hypothetical revolution in, say, like America, we wouldn't be talking about giving Puerto Rico independence.
Yeah, I mean, I might, but
yeah, but the mainstream probably wouldn't. Yeah, no. But you know, he does also touch on something that's interesting too, is that he notes that the League of Nations and the world order in general had been generally completely toothless against fascism up until this point.
Yeah.
He notes how many, I didn't write it down, the actual number, I should have, of countries that actually passed resolutions damning Hitler and denouncing Mussolini and denouncing Franco's seizure of power in Spain specifically, but no actual blows had been struck against fascism at this point. And the first blows that were struck against fascism were from this revolution in Spain, which is
where, like, if you watch like Lord of the Rings, where you have Gandalf up there with like, "You shall not pass."
Yeah,
that comes from the slogan "No pasarán." Like that. This is Spain is the first country where people actually mount a real defense, and there have been real, definite defeats of fascism.
Yeah, and understanding the ideology that led up to that is a very important thing too, which is what this chapter is mostly about. Something that Orwell kind of learns to his detriment a little bit too is that he kind of gets stuck in the POUM, even though his
Mhm.
philosophy doesn't line up exactly with them, because he didn't understand the politics of the
He just
militia
joined
movements. He, he
like,
just he just was like militia, militia, militia. There we go.
I'll go
I'm
with
in.
that militia.
I'm in.
They're
So
socialists, right?
yeah. So he got stuck. So politics, obviously politics broadly determines everyone's destiny.
Mhm.
Almost every aspect of your life is the function of some sort of political choice. But in this case, politics really did determine his destiny in a very intimate way, in that he got stuck with the POUM.
Yeah.
Uh, with
This you'll find later on, like the fact that he was a part of the POUM,
yeah,
and the POUM was spoiler, it was later suppressed
yep.
by Stalin. Like that informed a lot of Orwell's worldview. He may not have written 1984 had he not seen this.
A little hopeful note on the end of that is that the POUM actually kind of still stuck around a little bit and was legalized explicitly in '77. So if they could overcome Stalin and live under Franco for decades, you can still advocate for universal healthcare, kids.
Yeah, you can do it.
Keep going. A little funny bit is that he noted the Daily Mail was one of the most vile fascist apologia rags that was going in Great Britain. And
Yeah.
it's like, good to see not that much has changed.
Not that much has changed. I love there's a great YouTube video that I love to post whenever someone posts a Daily Mail article. It's a guy singing a song like it's all absolutely true because I read it in the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
And it's going by Daily Mail headlines and
Oh man.
refugees coming on an unprecedented scale. It has to be the truth because it's written in the Daily Mail.
Oh god. Oh man. It is interesting though, and kind of alienating for somebody who doesn't understand the background. Is Orwell starts talking about how the revolution wasn't for liberalism, and
Yeah.
he actually says it wasn't for democracy. And I'm reading that and I'm like, if I didn't know what he was talking about, this would be like super super alienating. And he goes on to discuss how overseas the cause of the revolution became kind of obscured because of this, because overseas you couldn't sell a product or a news product or a cultural product, or you couldn't sell a rhetorical device to people in America or Great Britain based on we're fighting for not democracy.
Yeah.
It's super unpalatable. But also, by that same token, he notes that war for democracy itself as a catchphrase had become completely poisoned in the West because of World War One and socialist movements, because that was the slogan that they went to war in World War One with. And
this is a war for democracy. Kind of like what we have now. It's like oil discovered on Mars, and you see the American eagle. Mars needs some freedom.
Freedom, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so and the war weariness that we have after 20 years is not a drop in the bucket compared to the war weariness Europe would have had after World War One, when especially in places like Great Britain, where like the male populations of whole cities were wiped out in like single days during that war. So you can kind of see why that happened, but the politics in the countries where the revolution was being talked about also obscured the cause of the revolution, which was to create a worker state along various different lines. For the POUM, it was more along slightly more traditional socialist lines, and then there were the anarchists, and then there were the Comintern Stalinists.
Yeah. And they're the PUSC, like I think Orwell says something like it when he first showed up, it looked like Spain was like being attacked by letters.
Yes, it is, because there's so many different militias and they're under so many different headings. Ah, crap! Sorry, I just dropped my notes because I am clumsy. It's a good thing that wasn't
very professional here.
that wasn't a grenade. I'm glad, but yeah. So for those people who don't know, the Comintern was the Communist International. So it was the International Communist Party, and a lot of people. This isn't like history that's really talked about in the U.S. So internationally, the Comintern was basically the arm of the Soviet Communist Party internationally, and the Comintern then supported the Spanish communists who were basically under the thumb of the USSR. And this is the chapter where Orwell starts to notice this. And the real politic of them being under the USSR's thumb like that has a lot of consequences. So you have the foreign involvement of global capitalism with the USSR, who's trying to mosey up and be close with France and the UK at this point as an important part of their international policy. So they don't want to market a revolution that's explicitly red at this point. And that kind of becomes an issue.
Yes. Well, this was a big issue with a lot of the Western liberal nations, is like the ones that might have wanted to oppose fascism. I would figure, I can't remember if the business plot had happened yet, but I know fascists had at one point did try to overthrow FDR.
This is 37.
Yeah. And I know that FDR, Ernest Hemingway created the Spanish Earth and screened it for FDR, trying to get American help. But the fact is that not the United States, Great Britain, even France just had no interest in helping the Spanish Republic. And they, a lot of them tacitly preferred the fascists to the Republicans. And part of it was they were afraid of the communists and the anarchists.
Right. Orwell explicitly mentions that France specifically didn't want a communist neighbor.
Yeah, which is a shame.
And it's also ironic because if you go back in the history, France invading Spain under Napoleon is what brought liberalism to Spain in the first place, and what touched off all of the wars that led up to this one. And now they're crushing the liberals. So history is a weird wheel sometimes. The specific factions that he mentions are there's 1.2 million people in the PSUC, which is the USSR / Communists International, who are Marxist-Leninists / Stalinists. Mostly they're trade unions with middle class opportunists joining in. Their line is basically nothing matters but winning, and that they're enforcing the status quo. And ironically, the revolutionaries are counter-revolutionary because they're setting their cause back of reestablishing
the status quo. Basically the PSUC or the PUSC, they're the Hillary Clinton of this conflict.
a little more evil because they're with Stalin, but just a little bit. There's 10 to 40,000 members of the POUM that he's in. He never became a party member, and he regretted it. He said after they were suppressed, especially, that he didn't get to have the card. I'm sorry, I was looking for a word there. And they also always inflated their numbers, so there was no way of really knowing how many dudes were actually in charge. They were communists, anti-Stalin, kind of Trotskyites, I guess. Broadly, you could call them Marxist-Leninists, I would say. They were mostly workers and peasants, and their leaders were more educated than the rank and file typically were. But they were also composed of multiple parties. They were anti-liberalism and anti-fascism because they obviously were fighting the fascists, but they also believed that liberalism inevitably led to fascists. They had a conflict with the PSUC because the PSUC wanted to establish a standing army, and the POUM wanted to keep workers' militias and workers' police forces in place. That becomes a serious issue, obviously, towards the end of the Spanish Civil War. And it's a conflict of ideologies because the PSUC and the Comintern's and the Stalinists especially are really focused on the institution of state socialism. At this point in the USSR, Stalin's doing the Socialism in One Country initiative. The Comintern...
And he's also trying desperately not to piss off like the Western liberal countries.
Yeah, and you can read, if you read Stalin's theory, which is either ghostwritten and not that great sometimes, you can actually see that in his writing. So these guys are like mortal enemies of that policy. And then you have about 2 million members of anarchist groups, the CANT and the FAI.
CNT5. Federation Anarquista de América and the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, I think is...
Trabajo would be workers, I think. Yeah. No hablo español, yo soy gringo.
Well, you probably had a better accent on that than I did.
Don't ask me to do Castilian.
That's the syndicalists / anarcho-communists.
Yeah, so he notes that they're a little hard to pin specifically for their ideologies because he doesn't understand it yet, and I thought that was really interesting.
Can't quite figure these guys out.
It's weird because he's never been exposed to anarchist theory before. I mean, like Kropotkin was like a relatively new thing at this point. It was kind of just getting circulated. So they were definitely anti-liberalism, worker control of industry. Local Soviets were their thing. They were vehemently anti-church privilege, and they hate the Marxist-Leninist politics that lead to centralization and control of like the vanguard party. So you see, what happens later is, of course, these guys kind of get into violent confrontations with each other, even while they're fighting the fascists. So you kind of see. Oh, sorry.
No. Well, this is interesting too because there were chances to work together, and usually something came in and got in the way of it. If I remember, there was a big thing that happened where the anarchists were really excited about the possibility of joining up with their old frenemies, the Marxists, and there was supposedly this big shipment of weapons that was coming in from the USSR to save everybody because they desperately needed them. And when the ship pulled in, everybody was really excited, and then they pulled open the boxes, and it was like rations. There's the one thing they didn't need, and that was definitely done on purpose because Stalin did not want the anarchists armed any more than they already were.
There's a great movie you can watch about the kind of frustration about dealing with the Comintern at that time. It's called Reds. It's an old Warren Beatty movie.
Oh, I've been meaning to watch that. The guy who helped me write the DeRudy screenplay kept recommending that I watch that.
It's a really good movie. It's about an American who went over to the Soviet. It's a true story. What was this guy's name? I'm trying to think. Oh, John Reed. That was his name. He wound up being like a delegate for the Comintern in Moscow. But it shows you how they kind of pulled the same trick in the what we would call like the stands now, like Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, etc. So there's a great part about dealing with this in that movie. If you prefer watching movies to reading depressing
history, movies are fun. Sometimes there are explosions. All right, so continue on. Orwell is basically doing the press at Occupy Wall Street. I don't know what they want, and they won't tell me who's in charge.
I find it really interesting for me that that Orwell says that initially he prefers the Marxists because he kind of prefers the order that they have. That's something that I kind of deal with too in my politics, is that I have to kind of watch myself because I am a little susceptible to taking action for action's sake. So he's seeing them just taking action, and he's not realizing that the action they're taking is in service to building an institution, which is like a centralized party under the control of the Comintern and ultimately Stalin.
Well, it's a very interesting thing because I think in a lot of ways the difference between a Marxist and an anarchist is it's one of temperament. In a lot of ways. Like I honestly think that me and Caleb talked about this, Caleb Maupin. He was like basically like, I thought anarchists were just people who, were interested in socialism but had no political education. And I'm like, thanks, Caleb.
Well, I'll do you one better. I used to think they were just immature people who didn't like authority.
Well, I did too before I actually had to learn about it. And the pop culture gives you that impression.
The anarchist A, the punk.
It's the anarchist A, the punk thing, the Joker in The Dark Knight. That's most, and also the anarchist guy in the 3rd season of Legend of Korra. That is still like haunting me.
I still haven't seen that show.
It's not as bad as people say it is, but the guys don't understand radical politics at all. They don't understand any politics other than like liberalism. But like even I'll find myself arguing with like a reactionary. Like the dude, and literally in the middle of it, he'll be like, and anarchists, every time they take over, then a dictator follows them. And I'm like, you got that from Legend of Korra. That's literally the plot, and it's never happened in history.
Jesus.
No, the way it goes is take over some territory. Then anarchists ally with with hardline Marxists. Things go great when they work together, and then the anarchists get backstabbed by the Marxists, and then the Marxists proceed to lose to the dictator.
Which is exactly what Orwell notes in this chapter. He talks about how the initial militia movement was the thing that stopped fascism dead in its tracks.
Yep.
That it was ideologically motivated. He talks specifically about these guys who are not soldiers, they're workers in towns, they're peasants in cities, running at machine gun nests and storming them with like sticks and stuff and whatever they could get their hands on. The ideological motivation like that is super important in warfare, which we've discussed in previous chapters. And that's giving way to the professional army that's being trained by the Central Party. And as that's giving way, the Central Party isn't really representative of the whole of the movement. So without the consent of the people, without the consent of the movement, they have to have something to use against the people, and that winds up being the Central Army.
Yep. Which, again, it really reminds me of Hillary Clinton. I really gotta say that. Like, it very much, and in how she suppressed Bernie and then immediately got around to losing to Donald Trump. And part of the reason why she suppressed Bernie and the Bernie movement was, we've got to beat Trump, and like there is something to be said for like the person who believes in order and rules and doing things the proper way, going up against a monster of fascism that projects strength but doesn't actually obey any of these rules that the other person thinks exist and believes in. And the only people who actually see the threat are fighting it and doing a damn good job. And then the person comes in and says, no, you're doing it wrong. And just destroys all of that enthusiasm. And then it's like, okay, we've got everybody marching in the right direction. Oh, and I've been defeated. Like,
yeah. And it's not only that they were using, that they were defeated ultimately by Franco's better centralized army. They were also defeated because that central army was also enforcing quote unquote left unity on the broader revolutionary movement. So it became almost more, despite their party line of win above all else, it almost became more important for the Central Party to be the Central Party than it was for them to win the war. And that you see that mission creep kind of, to use a little army term there, throughout this chapter as he's talking about the expansion of the Central Party. He also talks about how the POUM didn't have heretic hunters like the International Brigade, which was under the Central Party did, and they didn't have a lot of censorship in their mail. And I was just thinking, like, if they're modeling the Central Army off of the contemporary USSR army, it's not the Red Army of 1945 that we're talking about that actually won World War II. We're talking about a very politically charged army where the officers actually had to get commissars to countersign all of their orders.
Yeah.
So if you were like a company commander and you said, like, I'd like my men to do PT from 6:30 to 8, you'd have to get the commissar to sign off on it. And if he said that wasn't dialectic enough, you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And it had also been purged, like brutally purged by Stalin at this point. And so even the officers that are coming over, a lot of them are inexperienced and they've been promoted way above where their station should be. The Soviets famously ran into this at the beginning of World War II. Like the head of the Red Air Force was like 32 and like had no idea what he was doing. And that's one of the reasons the Red Air Force got wiped out in 41. Like that poor guy actually wound up killing himself almost immediately afterwards because he was afraid of what Stalin would do to him. But
that's a shame.
But they have good propaganda here because he notes that every airplane that flies over them, that's their airplanes, are Soviet airplanes.
Yeah.
So every airplane is propaganda.
Well, and this would have, again, if everybody could have actually gotten on the same page and there had been left unity instead of this jockeying for power and this need for like control beforehand, I really think there could have been a victory here. Because I don't think the anarchists could have taken the country on their own. Maybe if they, like I said, and I said this before and you've gotten on me for it, but if they had revolted and continued to spread the revolution through the South and captured the necessary munitions factories in the South, there's possibly a win there. but like really they don't have any tanks, they don't have any planes, they don't have any cannons, they don't have any war industry. You would need someone to provide that. And the fact is the Western liberal powers weren't going to do that, and the only one who would and did was the USSR, and I really honestly applaud them for that. The only thing is that I wish that the the desire to actually see a Spain free of fascism had carried them through, that they had been as dedicated to that as they were to testing their weapons and consolidating power, like political power, among the Spanish left.
And Orwell notes that it's kind of hard to do exactly that when the Central Party propaganda is calling the POUM, who's on the front line fighting, Tories. Alternatively, they're calling them Tories, fascists, cowards, and traitors.
Yeah,
that sounds a little difficult. And he also does pose a little counterfactual, like you did just now, though, where he notes that the international press prevented this from happening. But what if they had mobilized a international workers' movement against Franco? He's like, what if there were general strikes in the UK? What if there were mass workers' movements across Europe and America for the freedom of the Spanish people? And that he notes would have cut Franco off from his international support. Would have much more.
I don't know if it would have cut him off from like
Hitler, well, not Nazi Germany and Italy.
But what it would have probably cut off was Texaco's support, and without Texaco bankrolling him all the oil he needed, he wouldn't have been able to fuel those planes anyway.
That's true, but like also, if the British had gotten involved a little more, the British Navy probably would have cut off a lot of Nazi ship. You see how counterfactual snowball.
Yeah.
But he does note that the press was like the worst enemy of this happening, because he notes that like the exaggerated tales of atrocity were just everywhere in all of the press. He actually says that he's glad that the airplane is a new invention of warfare, because he wants to see a jingoist with a bullet hole in him just once, because he wants to see a reporter get shot, because he's noting that there's all of this very politically charged journalism around it. And the only journalists that he actually says were good were the Manchester Guardian. He actually gives them a little shout out. It's like, good work, Manchester Guardian.
It reminds me so much of Occupy. Really, like all of these dynamics were playing out on a smaller way. The press was slandering us all, except for like one or two publications on occasion. And like, it seemed like you again saw the same thing. We don't know what they want. We don't understand them. They won't tell us who's in charge.
And there's an interesting thing that happens to Orwell, is that he's on the front. So he's in this bubble of unity. So like the actual soldiers aren't calling each other traitors and cowards because they see each other fighting the fascists.
Yeah.
And the world is happening very fast behind the lines, and he's losing touch with it. There's a really great book called The Forever War that's kind of about this. It's a science fiction novel where a guy, he gets drafted for a war in space, and because of relativity, he deploys for like 3 months, but like 30 years pass. And he keeps getting deployed over and over again, so he gets more and more disattached. So if you want to know how that happens, it's a great book for that. But he actually laughs at the British guys who are trying to educate him about politics, because he's like, that's crazy. We're all left unity here. And then he learns real fast that they were right. And it's interesting that he didn't understand the politics of this, and he didn't understand that how politics cause conflict like this before he went into this.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And something also that is kind of I took away from this chapter is that Orwell notes that like the POUM and the anarchists and the left socialists are adaptable, and they change policy real fast. And that was their strength at the beginning of the war. And the institutional socialists on the right of the revolution, they're more about the institution, and they're more about centralized authority. And that might have been a good policy, he notes, at a certain point in the war. So he notes, like you, that if they had actually got on the same page, that their two different ideologies might have actually complemented each other, but that doesn't wind up happening. Yeah,
because you've got, when you're trying to work with like, essentially there's like two missions going on here for the the Marxists. One is build this political institution and take control with it, and the other is win the war. And the two missions seem to be in direct contrast with each other because they can't adapt, which is, one of the most important things to do, particularly at this point in history when like really stuff's going on so crazy, like, no, who knows?
Yeah. Who knows? By the time you're watching this, who knows what's happened?
Yeah.
In the next 48 hours.
Yeah. So continue. The anarchist strategy makes sense, especially in the early portion of the war. And there are times when the Marxist strategy would have been more effective had these two currents like just gotten on the same page. So continue.
So he notes that you have to adapt your policy to material reality in war and in everything, war especially. Clausewitz does talk about this in On War, but I'm not going to quote him at length this week.
No.
But yeah, like when you have a dogmatic adherence to one strategy or the other in anything, it breeds a stagnation, because if you commit all to the super loose strategy of the anarchists, then Franco's Central Army might rally and beat you. But if you commit all to the Central Party, you see what happens, where the Central Party just becomes institutionalized for the sake of the institution, and that's no good.
It kind of loses its necessarily its desire to win the war, and also kills the enthusiasm, which is the one thing that's driving people to resist fascism.
Right. Right, and that's the great strength, as I noted earlier, of the militia workers. Is that they're so ideologically motivated that they will do pretty much anything for this cause. And when you make it about a central institution of reinstituting parliamentary democracy and private property, you lose that ideological motivation, and you lose the politics that allow you to carry on the war. Orwell hilariously also talks at length about how he still wants to punch one fascist ticket during this war, and he still hasn't gotten to do it. He really wants to do it. He wants to see the bullet go in. And he wanted
fascists.
and everyone wants to go to Madrid too, which is really funny.
That's where the big fighting is.
It's really funny for me to hear that, because I don't want to see any big fighting if I can avoid it. I mean, like, if it's necessary, whatever. But like, to hear someone who hasn't really experienced it yet saying like, yeah, I want to go into that meat grinder
that is Madrid,
where like humans are going in and meat is coming out. Then it's interesting to hear that from somebody, and I think that he's going to change his tune towards the end of this book about that.
He may. I know what happens to him.
Yeah, I do too. But he notes that he's trying to get into the International Brigade. Like, he says he's going to go on leave and just switch over to the International Brigade. And he's noting that being in the POUM is actually saving him from this, because the International Brigade is under the Comintern. Yeah. And that he would have probably been hunted out as a heretic almost immediately in that.
Because he was there with the POUM. Which, again, like, if you're part of a group that is actively being slandered by the powers that be, it really shakes your perception of reality and how reality is. Like, I could never look at the media the same way again after Occupy. And similarly, I think Orwell couldn't really look at any kind of news or propaganda the same way after, he's sitting there fighting fascism with these people and being called a fascist.
Yeah. And he's coming to some of the conclusions about mass media and industrial culture that Adorno was almost contemporaneously to this conflict. I'm going to get you to read Dialectic of Enlightenment one day.
It'll happen. It says enlightenment, and tell me it's a Buddhist text. And
it's only like 150, 200 pages, I think. But the government at this point, I'm going through like 5.5 pages of notes, and I'm trying not to make this like 2 hours, guys. So please bear with me on this one. The government is divided too, and it's inconsistent, even though it's centralized. Ministers and parties and delegates are resigning and just being replaced constantly. And that's because
government, where people in the government are constantly resigning, getting fired, and being replaced. What's that like?
Yeah, and being replaced with unelected people. So like that definitely kills your movement too. And that it's interesting too that churches in Spain have a significantly different importance to people outside Spain than they do in Spain. The revolutionaries and on the left want to abolish the privilege of the Catholic Church. They want to seize that land, and they want to seize all of those resources for the people. Where when you hear that church gets looted, like just as an American right now, like imagine if you heard a church got looted somewhere, you would feel awful about it. Like even if you're like a hardcore new atheist, you'd be like, oh, why'd they loot the church?
Yep. Well, it's funny. I even had to deal with this, like, with regard to, like, I was sitting there arguing with an ANCAP today, and this is our ANCAP. I've had this exact same argument like 20 times over the last 6 years, and they always do this. They always be like, "Oh, the anarchists burned churches and killed priests," and I'm like, "Dude, like you do not understand how tied into the actual conflict the Spanish church was. Do you want me to send you the 5 freaking pictures of priests and nuns with guns, giving the freaking Sieg Heil? Do you want me to send that to you again?" And he's like, "Well, no," and throws up like the wiki for the Red Terror, and of course then I have to go and grab the wiki for the White Terror and be like, "Look, why are you still just focused on the Red Terror?" He's like, "Well, they killed priests and nuns." I'm like, "Franco killed priests and nuns. Read the damn thing." But like, I've had this conversation so many times. It's where everyone goes the first time whenever you bring up the anarchists in Spain is the atrocities against the church, which some of them, just because revolutionary chaos, probably weren't justified, but like the vast majority, it's an open war where the church is a combatant. So
you sound exactly like Orwell at that point. Like that's like the exact rant that he went on that I was talking about a minute ago about the foreign press.
Well, I had read this chapter and had
a couple times.
If I find my copy of this, I'll pick it out and I'll see.
Yeah, you'll see like underlines twice
about this.
And the other weird thing is that with the institutional creep, the USSR is one of 2 countries that's actually helping them. So it's USSR and Mexico, and Orwell's like, well, Mexico's not sending troops for obvious reasons. That obvious reason is the Atlantic Ocean and lack of a significant Mexican navy. Yeah. And the USSR's institutional creep means that they basically control the guns. Yeah. So he's noting that maybe the reason that he's not armed very well is politics. So you see politics encroaching on war again here, where the Comintern's basically distributing arms to people that are more loyal to them, even when it's not advantageous strategically.
Yeah. So again, you see leftists tripping over their own feet.
Yeah. And something interesting about the militia movement versus the Central Army. The Central Army is going to be more effective than an army of militia guys because it's professionalized and it's well equipped.
Absolutely.
But the militia guys wanted to have a central army, but they wanted to keep the anarchist and hard left ideology in the militia, in their new army. They wanted equal pay for all ranks, which is something that I actually think would be a good idea in the modern U.S. military. Like just a little bit of modern army aside here, like an E1 coming in, almost no one comes in as an E1, but an E1 coming in will make about $21,000 a year. And a general makes about I think it's like 250 base pay plus a lot more in allowances. Yeah. So it's kind of weird. Like whenever you hear military funding, it's never getting to the soldiers. But, it's going to the weapons. But they didn't want private property to come back, whereas the central institutions did. He notes that in a revolution, either the bourgeois swallow the workers, or the workers are going to swallow the bourgeois. And USSR realpolitik through Comintern at this point caused the bourgeois part of the movement to swallow the workers up. Yeah. So you have private property coming back. You have a centralized army that's being used to not only win the war but to maintain power for the Central Party. And you have less democratic structures. You're losing the politics that caused the revolution in the first place. So his thinking at this point is going to be like, well, why did we revolt against Franco in the first place if we're just going to replace him with a tiered system anyway?
If you're just going to replace one system of brutal hierarchy with another system of brutal hierarchy, especially when it's a liberal system of brutal hierarchy, like you really do start to wonder, like, why am I doing this? Yeah. what's also really interesting to understand about this period here, as the and we will get to the actual fighting between.
Yeah, I think it's the next chapter.
The next chapter, which is going to be super exciting.
Yeah.
But like as the regular army eclipses the militias, and as the Marxists eclipse the anarchists and the left parties like the POUM, what happens is that private property is reinstituted. Once private property is reinstituted, that's when shortages start happening. And that's also when like the black market suddenly becomes a big thing like it wasn't before. And you'll see it with, if you read Spain in Our Hearts by Adam Hochschild, who is a liberal who doesn't get anarchism like at all. But like he rightly points out that these shortages happened like as the old way of life reasserted itself. And of course, because without the revolutionary fervor, people become less willing to work together. And as they're less willing to work together, then you result to starvation and force. And suddenly there's no longer this giant boom of food there's no longer this beautiful thing worth fighting for.
But when has Stalinism ever caused shortages before?
I don't want to lean too heavily on that. Because
I'm sorry, guys. Stalin didn't. Well, I'm not going to say anything else.
Totally off topic. But the shortages were caused in a way, but not by the collectivization. They were caused by believing in a specific scientist, Lysenko, who falsified his research. And then what happened was for reasons of state and propaganda, that falsified research was said to be correct and said to have resulted in a massive food boom when it didn't. And then like countries like China believed it and we're like, man, we're gonna have so much food, and oops, no, because it was just one jackass who like had some very bad scientific ideas that sadly were politically convenient for his superiors.
When's that ever happened before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was about to talk about private property, but you hit it.
Oh, great. Yeah. So Orwell's talking about private. I love that I guess I'm just remembering this chapter. So Orwell's talking about private property being reinstituted.
Yeah. So pretty much exactly along the lines that you just did, where it kills the revolutionary fervor.
Mm-hmm. Which then kills the supply lines.
But then they're in a kind of a Sophie's choice there, where if they choose to embrace the revolutionary fervor, then their logistics from the USSR dry up because the USSR has to make nice for their real politic with France and Great Britain.
Right.
And then
But then if they're kind of in this catch-22 here, and you can see why the fascists succeeded in this conflict.
Yeah. And Orwell's just disgusted by this in the face of the horror that he's seeing on the front, even though it's limited, to see that this political maneuvering and especially the press characterizing the revolution in a certain way, it kills him. It really kills him. And I don't blame him, because it's something that I think every soldier kind of goes through in every war. I'm sure, like, if you go back to the Romans, there was some Roman that was like, those guys in Rome really don't understand why we're sacking Carthage, you know. but
it's funny. I was listening to the history of that just the other day, actually, like between the Carthaginians and Rome. It's fascinating.
It really is. It's a heck of a story, and mythologically, it has an interesting root too, which is a spurned love story. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am. In fact, that would be between Aeneas and Dido.
Yeah.
Yeah, Aeneas and Dido. Which, oftentimes great human conflicts do tend to boil down to like really petty crap like that.
Ironically, though, that war too has roots in Spain, because Carthago Nova was where Barcelona is.
Oh my!
And the Romans conquered that from the Carthaginians.
I hadn't put two and two together there.
Yeah.
So maybe if Carthage had won, we would have.
If Carthage had won, we'd be speaking Punic. But
well, it's really interesting. There was a there was a sign I saw in like a bar that I was in at one time. I was in this bar in like a small town, nowhere, USA. And I walk in and it says, if you can read this sign, thank a teacher. If you can read this sign in English, thank a soldier.
I've seen that bumper sticker and T-shirts so many times in my life.
And of course, me sitting there thinking that is like, but if we'd been conquered and I was speaking a different language, then I'd be reading the sign in that language. Should I thank the other guy then?
You would be. Bumper stickers are written by the victors. Bumpers in this case.
Bumper stickers are written by the victors. Okay, that needs to be a shirt.
It should, like right now. He does note kind of towards the end that the center of gravity for Franco would have been propagandizing the people behind his lines and trying to attempt a rising in Morocco, but no attempt like that was ever made. And we've already discussed the reasons why, but he notes that both the revolution in the Central Party and Franco were swinging to the right. So it was essentially, for the workers in Spain, it was a competition between two right-wing institutions. And
what's that like?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, shocker. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter to the people, because no matter who they win, they're going to be who wins, they're going to be under what they perceive as the same kind of right-wing institutions, even though Franco is demonstrably worse and his rule over Spain is going to be disastrous. He ends this chapter almost like he's ending the book in an interesting way. He notes that he's writing in 37, and he hopes all of this changes and that they can get together on one platform to defeat Franco and win, but he doesn't think it will. And hey, George, in the afterlife, it doesn't change. Sorry, buddy.
It really doesn't. And we still run into this problem today. Like, I think that I really think that we're coming for like a Biden victory, but it's the same problem with the left, where people are being forced to choose between two right-wing what right-wing jackass is going to be like is it going to be Biden or is it going to be Trump? Ultimately, like, I still think it's worth voting against Trump, because he's literally trying to become a dictator, and also he's kind of a monster beyond that, like, stole children from their parents and everything. But we have a comment from Munda Skeptical. Peace. Chapter 5 was the meat of the book, in my opinion.
It really was, and you should really read it on your own. I tried to. I have like 5.5 pages of notes on this. I'm trying not to get into like a long theory tangent, but definitely read this and take some notes, because if this is your introduction to like left thinking, you're going to see a lot of these things come back as you start to read different theorists, especially contemporary ones. Yeah, this is a very interesting.
It'll also happen like as you take part in leftist movements and street movements like Occupy. You see this story again and again and again, and that's one of the reasons why Homage to Catalonia is such an important book to read for like anybody on the left or anybody interested in activism,
or anybody. Period. It's actually a really great piece of literature.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Even though Orwell brings everything to a
screeching halt. He really could have interspersed some of this, but like, I'm not a literary critic in 1937, so.
Yeah. So what's your takeaway from this, since we are, it seems that we're now at the end of the chapter?
It's kind of what you're saying is like the oldest story of populist movements rising up and then being kind of swallowed up by the centralized institutions. And in this case, it was through control, the means of violence. And other times it's done by the media, which we also saw in this chapter. And I guess the moral of this is that you have to be super careful about the culture industry, because the press in general is an industry. It has an agenda, which is to make money in our case. And it will package and sell your movement in a way that's profitable to it, period. Don't give up, because even though the POUM loses the war ultimately, they're still kind of around today, even after enduring Franco's dictatorship. Be really skeptical about authoritarian personalities in any movement, especially radical politics movements, not only because the results usually aren't very good if they do win, but in cases like this, they'll prioritize things like crushing internal opposition over actually crushing the stated external opposition. Ironically, the right wing in China suffered this during the Japanese War. When the Japanese invaded, instead of fighting Japan, Chiang Kai-shek kept trying to fight Mao with the American weapons that we gave him.
Yeah.
So the centralized institutions will prioritize internal enemies over external enemies a lot of the time. It's a really meaty chapter from a really meaty book, and you can
absolutely. I mean, honestly, like this is not my favorite chapter in the book because, like I said, it's just all politics.
Yeah.
But like, it is a key chapter in the book. Like, if I were there should be a better way to deliver this information than in just one chapter that's a giant info dump.
Yeah.
But and that's the screenwriter in my head is like, how do I dramatize this? But at the same time, it's almost the entire book in a single chapter.
It kind of is, and especially because he actually starts the chapter saying he doesn't want to do an info dump, and then he proceeds to do an entire info dump. He's like, I want to save this for later in the book. Proceeds to do like, I think this chapter was almost like 30 pages in my edition.
Yeah. So what I would say is my sort of takeaway from this, and I was reading this, just after Occupy, I think. Yeah. And my version of the book is covered with notes relating to this. And even, when I'm reading the Durruti book or any of the other leftists, we do see the same patterns happening again and again. And I definitely agree that you need to watch out for people with authoritarian personalities. And that's not to say that everybody who identifies as a Marxist or doesn't want to go moon a cop is dangerous. And a lot of them are really great comrades, but like there's that type of tanky that comes into like every Facebook group or whatever, or every minor party notes and tries to do their own coup. Like it's like they want to practice their revolution on other revolutionaries.
Well, I had a teacher who told me something very profound once, where he told me it was a class about dictators that I was taking, and he told me that pathological situations breed pathological politics, and pathological politics attract pathological personalities. So men like Franco are attracted to pathological situations. Men like Stalin are attracted to pathological situations. Hitler, Pinochet, et cetera, et cetera. So when you have to be also aware of the moment that you're in, which is a really difficult thing to do, especially when you're in an important moment.
Yeah. But what would you consider a pathological situation? Are you
well, I mean, in the case of the Soviet Union, years of civil war, brutal material conditions,
chaos
is a ladder. Exactly. Like everything in Game of Thrones is a pathological situation after episode like 4. Cuba under Batista could be considered a pathological situation, even though they weren't necessarily as materially immiserated as other nations were. Chile with Pinochet's military government would definitely be a pathological situation. Weimar Germany is the classic example of it, when the hyperinflation hit after the Great Depression and they had to use wheelbarrows of money to buy bread. That is a pathological situation in politics. If you want to come on my show, we can have a long discussion about this.
I think that would be great. I mean, like what I wanted to so we got some people in the chat. Macre. Hey, I hope I'm totally mispronouncing your name. I think
it's Macracy.
Authoritarian left these days, dude. I think it's totally fine if somebody is more auth left or lib left. Ultimately, the goal is the same. Like more of what I'm talking about is people who, and this, there are pathological ways that people on the lib left behave and pathological ways that people on the auth left behave. So I was describing one of that, but I really think ultimately, I've said this before, it's better to have like a true enemy than a fake friend, if that makes sense. Or someone. Surround yourself when you both in life and in activism with people of integrity before surrounding yourself with people who may think exactly the way that you think. It's one of the reasons I maintain my friendship with Caleb. Beyond it's important to have a variety of approaches and personalities to draw from in any group. But what you really want to watch out for is the people within that group who are more dedicated to themselves or their own particular vision than the actual task that you are trying to accomplish. And they can be very difficult and very insidious, and oftentimes they will initiate some kind of destructive spiral in your group. And sometimes, they're people that were paid, and sometimes they're just crazy, and sometimes they're just misguided. It really depends. But I think anyone can have any type of opinion for the most part when it comes to left politics. It's more what can you do in the moment and who can you work with.
Yeah. And avoid going into the same historical cul-de-sacs that previous movements have gone down.
Yeah, absolutely. And so overall, I felt like this was a surprisingly good chapter. I'm glad the audience bared with us.
Thanks. I'm on cold medicine too, guys, so I'm sorry if I'm a little boring today.
No, you're never boring, Bobby. Particularly, except when you talk about Foucault, then you're boring.
But everything's a prison.
Yeah. Now, Moon is skeptical here. We have Orwell gets Tankies mad with Animal Farm. The funny thing about Animal Farm is the book is always interpreted as being more anti-communist than it actually is, because at the end of the book, Orwell doesn't say the pigs are worse than the farmers. The pigs become the farmers. They become the humans in much the same way that we saw what happened to the USSR when the revolution was repressed and then dismantled. And now it's, a capitalist nation like any other.
Is that the first instance of furries then? Because there's pigs in suits at the end of the story.
Oh, God. No, because the first...
Was George Orwell the first furry?
Yes, we'll just say that George Orwell was the first furry. That'll be a T-shirt
with the pig in the suit.
With the pig in the suit, yeah. I got a question here from the audience. How do we get people to not have a deranged thought of a Nazi? Around every corner with. So how do we get people to not freak out about secret Nazis around every corner with everyone they disagree with? And oddly, that this chapter was very into that, because that was what was happening to the Poom.
Well, I would say that the first step is actually understanding what fascism is. Because a lot of people's understanding of fascism is just Saving Private Ryan, guy in a Nazi uniform, or hysterical freshman on a campus yelling Nazi at somebody. I actually, you can't see me because I'm a disembodied voice now. I have a medical condition, but I was living in DC. I wear an undercut, and I was wearing a suit, and I was walking down the street, and this woman yelled Nazi, and I look around, and I'm wondering where the Nazi is, because I want to see this go. And then she's pointing at me, and I'm like, oh no. But
you had an undercut?
Because I had the straight up Hitler Youth undercut. It was rough. It was rough. I was in the army, man.
The Nazi haircut.
I watched too much Boardwalk Empire. It was my own fault. But the answer to that question is understand what fascism actually is. There's a tendency to overuse it. Now, there's also a fear to use it sometimes when it is applicable. So kind of, if you really want to know what fascism is and have a good base for identifying it in the world, read Umberto Eco's Fascism. That's a very accessible essay, and it's free online, and it's a great framework of that. You can also read works by Martin Overy. There's a book called Dictators that's used as a college textbook a lot. It's actually a comparison and contrast between Hitler and Stalin and why they're different. So if you hear the right-wing argument, Nazis were socialists, you'll actually be able to, in detail, explain why it's wrong. You can also read Albert Speer's book about the economy of the Third Reich and understand what fascist economics look like. But once you have a basis in understanding what fascism is, you'll be able to identify what fascism isn't.
A way you can also look at it, and I'm 1000% behind what Bobby just said, when you're trying to identify a fascist, there's a holistic way you can look at it too. And the way a fascist distinguishes themselves from a radical of another kind, particularly a radical leftist, is you have to look at the motivations. The motivation of a radical leftist, even one that goes very, very wrong, is a belief. It's an inherent belief in the equality of all human beings without rank or distinction.
Yeah.
This is really, really important. So even, and like as Che Guevara said, a revolutionary is motivated by great feelings of love. And you can tell when a person, even if they are very, authoritarian and buttoned down, if they have that belief, they will behave and talk and think and treat people very differently than someone else who believes in superiority, who believes in the superiority of one people above another, and actually believes that some people are so inferior they don't even deserve to live and don't deserve rights. The fascist is someone who has been driven insane by the idea of equality, who finds the very notion of that to be abhorrent. And even if they lie about it, that's at the core of where they're going. And it's one of the reasons why fascism is worse than even the worst, even the absolute worst versions of socialism and Marxism that you could have out there. Because ultimately, the Bolsheviks said, oppose us and die. And there's a lot of problems with that. But the Nazis just said die.
Yeah. They did. Well, the difference, that same teacher told me, like, one of the easier ways to tell the difference is that the communist will kill you because you're not a communist. The fascist will just kill you. They'll kill you because you're not the in group.
Yes. And for the record, killing people because they're not communists
it's not a good idea. No, he was specifically talking about Stalin at that point.
Okay, great. Well, we're at the end of the stream. I still need to read Animal Farm. That's good. Yeah, read Animal Farm. I would also recommend read a little bit of Down and Out in Paris and London.
That's actually a really good book.
Yeah, it's Orwell living as a crust punk. And we have from Zevin X, can't stick around, have to sleep. Good. Sleep is good, but we'll watch later. Just wanted to say you're a huge inspiration and you do great work. Keep it up. Dude, thank you. That really means a lot. At my time in Occupy and in New York, both as an artist and a writer and a political thinker, it can often feel like you're beating your head against a wall and shouting at a bunch of people that either don't hear you or don't understand you. And I live for the times that I can communicate with people, even if they don't agree with me on everything. That we can have that connection. That's why I do this. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right. Well, that was sorry. That got really heavy all of a sudden. Did not intend for it. Bobby, you want to plug your pluggables?
Yeah. So I'm Moustache Mafia on YouTube, Moustache Mafia on SoundCloud. I am Moustache Bob 2 on Twitter. If you're Moustache Bob 1 or Moustache Bob, please reach out to me. I want to know who got that original handle before I did. A little bit slow lately because of scheduling issues, and I've had flu from hell for the last week or so, but we'll be getting a little more content up there soon, hopefully.
Absolutely. And I've been a bit slow lately because I am doing the Kickstarter fulfillment for Snow White Zombie Apocalypse #2, which is here. I'm signing like 350 comics. Well, actually, since it's 2 comics, like 700 comics. Oh God, sending them out to you guys. So please bear with me while I get these out. I will get them to you before Halloween. That's a big goal of mine. And be on the lookout for Snow White Zombie Apocalypse #3. Anyway, thank you guys so much. This is Brenton Lengel signing off.